Hello, 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 everybody. Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
For Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. But yeah, we're back with another live stream. It's been kind of a wild day, I guess you could call it. We had two games, and we're going to cover both of them. And the first one was Bulls Heat. Kind of a slogfest, if you want to ask me. 112 to 91 was the final score. Heat came away with the victory. What were your thoughts on this game initially? I wasn't too pleased with this one. Did not go the way that I thought it would. I don't think it went the way that you thought it would either. But, pretty much two words, Tyler Hero.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much I think the key or the theme of both of these games is just the fact that both teams got, kind of, tough blows in the previous playing games that they were in, right? Where they were both, in the game, back and forth, down to the wire, and then lost right at the end. Had some tough losses, right? Obviously, the Heat lost Butler, the Pelicans lost Zion. And then in the Heat game, right, they pretty much showed out against the Bulls. And like you said, we both thought the Bulls were going to win based off of it felt like the momentum was headed towards their way. But, to be fair to Miami, they were 13-9 without Jimmy Butler. And even without Rozier, they still had, a number of players. It was just the question was, how were they going to perform offensively in this game? And this was a way better offensive performance than, the other night against the Sixers. And it also kind of goes to show that the Bulls, just as a team, are not quite in the same tier as, the top 8 teams. Because I think initially we kind of thought that both Philly and Miami would get in. It's just obviously, with the Butler injury, that makes the difference. But, compared to the Philly game, right, like Tyler Hero was not 9 for 27. Shot basically right under 50%, which is what you would want, right? And it was still on some tough shots. But the defense for the Bulls is a lot different, right? It's a smaller team than Philly, right? Even though you do have Caruso, and a lot of athletic guards, right? It's just not the same in terms of size, but he had 32, 10, and 9. Pretty much made the vast majority of his shots. Bam Adebayo, right? Didn't really have to do a ton of scoring, right? But did play some good defense. Love off the bench, right? He was huge as well because he was good in the Philly game too. But he was able to do more on the offensive end, right? He got I think he had 10 free throws against the Bulls, made all 10 of them, right? Had 7 boards, had a nice assist, right? So that was really the difference, right? Most of the Heat players, right? Jaquez, right, had a great game, 21, 6, and 5. And that was really the difference, right? Like most of their players had much better offensive performances this time around. The Homelander says, "What's up, yo?" Yeah,
Oh, wow.
congratulations. But also congratulations to your team for being the number 1 seed, right? OKC
Uh,
has done a great job this regular season,
yeah,
which
long
is
time
amazing.
no see, man.
Yeah, long time no see. Youngest team in the NBA. To make the 1 seed, that's a huge accomplishment. So, props to your team for being able to do that. But back to this Heat Bulls game, yeah. I mean, that was kind of the difference, right? It just kind of felt like Chicago probably just didn't really belong. I think, it was kind of probably an overreaction to what happened in the Hawks Bulls game, but at the same time, again, sometimes in a 1 game scenario, things can happen where a team gets hot, and then before you know it, it's over. But for the Bulls, it kind of just makes you wonder. Thank you, we are finally good again. Yes, yes, congratulations to Oklahoma City.
Yeah.
It's nice to see. Um, but when you look at the Bulls, it kind of just makes you wonder, like, because we talked about it, we thought that they should kind of blow a lot of this up at the deadline, right? I know we talked in the last stream about, yeah, just try to see if you can get in and get your young guys some experience, but that has nothing to do with like, you could have moved Andre Drummond, right? Did he really do a ton in either of these playing games? Not really, other than injure Alex Caruso and get a few rebounds, I guess.
Yeah.
And then, like other guys on the roster as well, right? Obviously like Caruso, right? Again, could have helped the playoff team, but instead pretty much was in 2 meaningless play-in games, and now he's home. So that's kind of rough. I just don't really understand what the point of what Chicago's been doing the last couple of seasons has been. It just seems like they're just content with being mediocre. Doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, but that just seems to be what their MO is, um, for the last several years, right?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think there's probably more to say about the Miami Heat victory than there is about, the Chicago Bulls and their loss and what their direction is going to be. But yeah, for like Miami, I think you feel great about this. Way to bounce back. I think, everybody on the team really just showed out. And I think it kind of shows you that there are levels to this, where the Bulls are able to steamroll over Atlanta. That kind of tells you where Atlanta was and where Chicago was, relative to that. And then you look at Miami where it's like, okay, this is a much more competitive team compared to both of them. So I think, there's a skill gap for sure in both conferences, but specifically like the East, you can really see it when, the game happened like the way it did. Jaquez, I think, you love to see what he was able to do. As a rookie, showing out like this, 21 points. Like you said, Tyler Hero, he did an amazing job, I think, bouncing back from the horrible, inefficient game that he had earlier. And then Bam, I think he did a great job as well. But, for the Bulls, I think it's more so, you need to take a look at the roster, retool a little bit, and, focus on the draft maybe and really moving on from LaVine. I think that's also something you need to do as well, because Kobe White didn't have a great game. But I think, you kind of know what he is at this point, and I think he's better suited for this roster, I think, than Zach LaVine.
I think that's kind of how you have to look at it if you're Chicago. You got to, in the offseason, see if you can move some of these guys. I think Drummond is a free agent, if I'm not mistaken, because I think he's been there for 2 seasons. So I think his contract is up. So again, don't know why they didn't just trade him to somebody. But Caruso, I think, has 1 more year left. So maybe you can get something for him in the offseason. DeRozan's a free agent, so we'll see where that goes. Maybe they re-sign him. What do you do with Lonzo, right? Is he going to be able to come back and play? Don't know. But I do like some of their other guards, but I don't really know what the future is for this team. But hopefully we can get some. Yeah, forgot LaVine existed. Homelander. Yeah, I mean, he's been out for a while, and they've honestly been relatively fine since he's been out. I mean, his first injury earlier in the year was kind of what initially sparked their run. That's not to say that he's a bad player or that he makes your team worse. It's just, again, there were so many guards that, now you kind of, I guess, have a better idea of who you should probably keep. I just don't think it makes as much sense to keep LaVine. And I think with some of the other guards you have, you could probably get away with not having to get as much back for LaVine. And I don't think you're going to anyways, because I just don't. I think teams think he's a good player, but, not good enough to give up everything to go get Zach LaVine.
Yeah.
But it's tough because he makes so much money that you have to find a way to pile together 40 whatever $million in terms of, contracts to get him.
Yeah, but I feel like that this playing game was so awkward, and we kind of got fooled and baited once again by, the Miami. I don't even know what you would really call it, but, they just tend to kind of turn it on and turn it off at some points, and I think they really turned it on tonight. Especially, it was very surprising without Jimmy Butler. But then if you kind of break down the stats, I think they were 13-9 without Jimmy Butler during the season. So I mean, they were. This was like a comfortable position for them. It wasn't like super uncomfortable for them. So I think that was a huge factor. Like, they know how to win without Jimmy Butler. They've done it various times throughout the season. And then I feel like there were a couple of guys here that were kind of intriguing to me, like DeLon Wright. I think he might play a big factor in their series, which I guess we should probably talk about between Miami and Boston. We get that rematch, which should be very intriguing. I'm sure it's going to go differently than it did last year. However, I think the door is always open with this Miami team. It's just a matter of the fact that you don't have Jimmy Butler,
I think that's really the tough part for Miami, where it's like, you just all season the injuries have kind of hurt, how we can really feel about them, because they've had a lot of games where, they had stretches where they looked good, and then other stretches where they weren't quite as good. And then you had a long stretch, right, where different guys were in and out of the lineup, right? You had 2 separate, weeks, basically, right? Terry Rozier's been out for the last week or so. When he first got there, he was out for a little while, right? Obviously, he was out in both of these playing games. We don't know what his status for game 1 is going to be. Just a lot of guys in and out due to injury. I mean, they lost Josh Richardson, and that was a guy that, helped them. But, DeLon Wright, to be fair, has, been a solid replacement. But, yeah, like you said, obviously now with the Heat winning this game, they're going to be the 8th seed. They're going to be playing the number 1 seed in the Boston Celtics in the first round. Like you said, rematch of last year's conference finals, but this time in the first round. Both teams, obviously Boston's made significant changes to their roster, right? Guys like Marcus Smart, Robert Williams, Malcolm Brogdon, those guys are gone, and in their place, right? Porzingis, Drew Holiday, right? And others. So, I mean, I don't know. Without Jimmy Butler, like you said, I think it's going to be really tough for Miami to be actually, able to win this series. But, they have, like you said, they've been in the spot before without Jimmy Butler, so they may be able to win, maybe a game or something like that at home, just because of, just some of the role players just having a hot night. But I don't know. It's kind of tough because with Boston, obviously they remember what happened last year. So there could also just be a scenario where Boston just is mentally prepared for what Miami's going to do. Obviously with Porzingis, you have more size now that you didn't really have last year. And they may just end up crushing the Miami Heat this time around. So I don't know. If Butler was there, I think you could give Miami at least a shot. I just think, without him, I think it's going to be really tough to pull off the upset, unless, a couple of the other guys for the Heat, turn it up like multiple levels, right? Like Jaquez, if he basically plays like how he played tonight, right, against the Celtics, right, is like Jimmy Butler light, right? Then,
Yeah.
okay, maybe you might be able to win a game or something. But I think that's a lot to ask out of a guy like that, where this is going to be basically his first, real test in terms of playoff basketball. And then Hero, right? We know in the postseason generally hasn't played as well. And without Butler, he's going to be more of a focus. They're probably going to look to try to take him out of the series on both ends of the floor. Rozier, right? If he's healthy and plays, then you have two guards, but they're both, one of the, they're both kind of not very physical, small-ish guards. I know Hero's 6'5", but he's not really known for being a strong defender. So I don't know. I don't really see a pathway for Miami to win without Butler, unless he shockingly comes back. But they've been saying he's going to be out for multiple weeks, so I'd be surprised.
Yeah, I think like you said, if Butler is there and he's able to play the entire series, it's a completely different conversation, I think. But the only thing that could potentially win Miami, even like 1 or 2 games, I think would really be their defense and the zone that they do run, because I think it is kind of exquisite. I think it could give anybody a problem, and I mean like anybody in the NBA in general. I think the way that they run it and the way that they switch it up, going back to man, and then mid play they're going back to zone. So it's kind of wild to see that. But I just still think Boston's star power is a lot. And also offensively, I think the Heat are going to face a huge issue, especially with the additions of Porzingis and then Drew Holiday. It's just a lot. I think it's too tall of a task for them. But it is kind of nice to see them back in the same position that they were in last year. And I get it. They're going to try and replicate it. But without Jimmy Butler, like you said, it's going to be a hard task. And I just don't think they're going to be able to do it.
And I think, the fact that we're kind of already hearing, rumors about like, hey, the Heat are, according to Woj, are looking, for a star in the offseason. The fact that we're already hearing about it, I mean, that kind of gives me like, sort of an indication that like, yeah, they're probably looking towards the offseason because they know that they're probably not going to have a good shot. Yeah, the Homelander says it's going to be a sweep. It would not surprise me at all
Yeah.
if it was a sweep. It's just incredibly hard to win playoff games without your best player. I mean, we've seen, teams do it before in terms of like winning a game, or two, right? Like I think, last year, right, Ja missed a game and they were able to win one, or I think what was it, 2 years or 3 years ago, right? The Pelicans won, a couple without Zion, but it's incredibly hard, to win a playoff series without your best player because I mean that's what your team is built around. So,
Yeah.
and in the playoffs, once teams really lock in and adjust, it's just too tall of a task. So I think this one is probably going to be a quick series. Maybe Miami, like you said, wins a game because they play great defense and Boston just can't hit a shot, anywhere on the floor. But I think winning like 4 games would be just insane. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, if that were to happen, I think Celtics fans honestly might just have to like just delete the franchise.
Yeah, for sure. I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess we move on to the next playing game. Right. This one I think was a little bit more entertaining. And that was the New Orleans Pelicans 105-98, right? You called it. You thought New Orleans was going to win. Um, so, shout out to that pick. And I think in the game, I think you kind of saw the reasons why. It just seemed like Zay Williams King sucked. Yeah. I
Hey,
mean,
man.
we slept, as people who've watched this podcast know, we were not quite as high on what the Kings were going to be able to do this season. I don't think we expected them to miss the playoffs, but I did think that we expected them to probably have a drop off and be towards the play in. And they were in the play in, and they did have, I think part of that was, towards the latter half of the season, especially the last week or whatever. They played 500 basketball. They lost Malik Monk, so that's a big factor that hurts their offense. And that's kind of what happened in this game, right? In this game, it kind of just goes to show that New Orleans was the more talented team. And that's why it made sense, for them to just go in there and just win. Obviously, in the first quarter, right, it was a back and forth. And then eventually, New Orleans' talent just was too much. Ingram being healthy or, looking healthier, that was a big factor. That's kind of what we talked about in the previous stream, where if New Orleans lost money because of them, yeah,
Ooh, I
yeah,
bet,
that's
bro. I
pretty rough.
bet. I'm not
That's
laughing
rough.
at that, but I'm laughing at the fact that, of course, it was the Kings.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, I'm sure people lost a lot of money. I mean, like, because I'm sure people bet, multiple times that they would either win or lose games, and it was the exact opposite happened.
Yeah.
But, in this game, New Orleans just was more talented. I mean, the bench was kind of the big difference, right? Where as soon as the second unit came in, they kind of just ran the Kings' second unit off the floor because the Kings really didn't have a second unit, really didn't get anything from their bench. Unlike the Warriors games, not all the starters played all that great, right? Like Keegan Murray, who was, the best player on the floor basically in the Warriors game, didn't really play as well. Got hurt, right, and missed a little bit of time, but still just wasn't the same. And I think you kind of saw like going into the play-in, I think we both thought that the Lakers and New Orleans would probably be 7 and 8 because I think we thought that those were the two best teams of the 7 through 10. And they kind of showed it, right? Like, even without Zion, they they handled them pretty easily.
Yeah.
I mean, they've beaten them what 6 times, I think, this year, including this game. So, I mean, we didn't get a huge game from CJ McCollum, but you got good performances from a lot of other guys, right? Ingram was really good, easily his best game, right? Since before he got hurt. The Homelander said the Pelicans are barbecue chicken. We'll
Oh,
get
I
into that
forgot.
matchup.
They're gonna have to play them. I forgot about that.
Yeah, we'll get into that matchup momentarily. But Valanciunas, had a bounce back performance after pretty much just a brutal week of basketball, right? Where in the two Lakers games, he was not very good to say the
Yeah.
least. Um, and then right the second unit, Alvarado, Larry Nance, Najee Marshall, right? They came in and kind of changed the game. I think Marshall had been hurt, so he hadn't really played in the last few games. Um, and that's kind of the thing we talked about, where we like a lot of the players on New Orleans' team. We think it's a quality team. It's just the problem is they're two stars. You can't really trust them physically because, obviously they were healthy for the majority of this season. And then right at the end, then they just get hurt. And then, things change. They fall into the play-in. They were in real danger of, falling out of the plan, but they got in. So you give props to them, but now they're kind of in the same spot as they were the first time they made the playoffs, where you're going to be in there and you're probably going to be without Zion for most of the series, right? I know he's supposed to be reevaluated in a couple of weeks, but by a couple of weeks the series could be over and he hasn't even really played. So either way, they've been in this place before, so they know how to play without Zion. We've talked about how the team looks a little bit different, when one of just Ingram or Zion are out there. I think part of that is because I think they're kind of a strange fit together. But either way, you slide Murphy in there, in place of Zion, and he's still able to, he's not the same type of player at all, more of a perimeter oriented guy. But that's the thing, your defense isn't really going to change. It's just your offense is going to look different because you don't have quite as much slashing and inside scoring capability, but you have way more threats on the perimeter. And they, that was kind of the difference here, right? The 3-point shooting combined with the size and the length disrupted the Kings offense, which the Kings offense, that's really been their problem the latter part of the season. Their defense had been much better, but their offense has taken a huge step back, right? They were the number one offense last year, pretty much middle of the pack this year. Trey Murphy is amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's a really good player, and
On
that's the
both
guy
ends.
that and that's the guy, if it wasn't for Zion, right, he'd be starting, right? He comes off the bench for them. Um, but yeah, for the Kings, that was really the difference, right? Outside of Fox, you didn't really get a ton from anyone else, right? I know Sabonis had what, 23, 14, and 7, but I thought like some of that was like kind of when the game was sort of over, right? I feel like other than the first quarter, I don't think he was quite as impactful as he had normally been in the regular season, which was kind of a the reason why we not always very high on the Kings. Fox obviously was good, but he kind of had to do too much, right?
Yeah.
Because of the fact pretty much had no other real offensive options, which has been the case, right? Without Malik Monk, you're kind of forcing, Fox into pretty much, it's him or bust. And it just, it wasn't good enough tonight, right? But they didn't lose the game because of him. It was just he didn't have enough on the offensive end to really make up for Malik Monk's absence, which is why we thought even if they got in, it was gonna be really tough. Um, but their season is over, right? And that's kind of rough, right? You go from the 3 seed last year. You did lose in the first round to Golden State, but there was, reasons, I guess, internally to be optimistic because it was your first time making the playoffs in what, 20 years or whatever. and now you're back where you started again, where now you're back out of the playoffs, and you're going to probably have to find a way to retool and add some more talent because the West got better, and the Kings didn't get better enough, right, to be able to keep up. Although to be fair, right, Malik Monk got hurt right at the end, but pretty much all of last year they were healthy, right? They had pretty much good injury luck for 2 straight years, and
Yeah.
then right at the end it cost them.
Yeah, it's crazy, and I think this was a very odd game. I think up until maybe like third quarter, I was very back and forth at times. But then like second half, Brandon Ingram kind of came alive, and I think that was a really big factor, which is something that I talked about. I was like, if you want to win this game, you need Brandon Ingram or CJ McCollum to show up. Bulls Kings gone fishing. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that kind of shows both those teams are just not that good, and they weren't good, and that's why they are where they are.
And that's why we didn't expect them to make the playoffs. Even though our picks kind of had to shift back and forth, but going in, we didn't expect either of them to get in.
Exactly, and like injuries were a huge factor on determining why our picks were what they were. But with the Pelicans, I think you have to feel really confident. Brandon Ingram's kind of looking like himself again. I think very inefficient in the first half, but that second half was amazing. I think that was a masterclass, and he played a little bit of defense. I was happy to see that. Everybody else kind of rallied around that as well. Defense turned into offense. That's kind of the name of the game with the Pelicans. They just do that. That's exactly what they do, and they executed perfectly, and definitely countered everything that the Kings tried to throw at them. And the Kings, it all goes back to what happened last year. It was a Sabonis and Fox show. Nobody else really was doing anything, and sometimes even Sabonis didn't show up. It was mainly a Fox show. So now that it's back to the same old thing, and you just need that third star, I think, from the Kings, and then you'll feel better about them. But as of right now, currently constructed, not it. But yeah, I think you do feel good about the Pelicans, but I don't feel good about their next matchup for sure. I think that's going to be a tough one, considering that you won't have Zion for at least, a couple of games?
Right. Well, yeah. There's Keon Ellis, 0 points in this game, minus 20.
Yeah.
But again, I think it also kind of goes to show the difference in going from Golden State to New Orleans, right? Because obviously New Orleans has a lot more flexibility and depth in terms of the wings, in terms of the offensive creation, the different types of players. So that's kind of what happens. And again, the Kings did not win a single game against New Orleans this year. So, but going into this, now the playoff bracket is set, right? Obviously, we talked about the East matchup, with the Heat and the Celtics. Not a lot to really talk about there. But now we're going into a playoff matchup where it is the New Orleans Pelicans as the 8th seed versus the 1-seeded Oklahoma City Thunder, right? So obviously, kind of an interesting matchup. Two very different teams, right? OKC obviously, a smaller team, outside of Chet, and then the Pelicans. You do have some bigs over there. But with the Pelicans, you're without Zion Williamson. That's their best player. That's the guy that attacks the basket, that's physical, that could cause some matchup problems. The Homelander, he says OKC winning it all.
It's an interesting take.
I think in terms of this series, I feel like you kind of have to go with OKC. I think in the regular season they've played pretty well against New Orleans. Even with Zion out there, right? So I don't think you can necessarily say like, oh, OKC has no chance. I think Sacramento would have probably been a worse type of matchup, depending on if their, regular season success translated. But I think you have to feel pretty good if you're OKC about being able to beat New Orleans, especially without Zion. I think Shea, he's going to be the best player on the floor. It'll be interesting to see what New Orleans kind of throws at him defensively to see if they can kind of slow him down. What do they do in terms of, say, like a Josh Giddey, right? Where, for the earlier part of the season, he struggled, but to close the season, he played a lot better. He was shooting the ball better, just looked a lot more comfortable because that's kind of what some teams were starting to try to do was leave him open. And I think really for OKC, the main thing for them is if the guys, if the other guys outside of Shea and Jalen Williams, get those open opportunities and they can consistently knock them down, that's where they're going to be, much more effective because, again, you got Lou Dort, right? You have Giddey, as we already talked about, right? Jalen Williams is like the second attacker. And then obviously Chet, right? His length, his length on defense and his ability to stretch the floor should be kind of interesting to see what New Orleans does with Valanciunas, right? Because, Valanciunas, obviously, if you're going to ask him to step out on the perimeter, That's kind of tough. But, you would think he'd be able to kind of use his physicality to post up. I don't know. It's going to be interesting because again, OKC is a very young team, even younger than New Orleans. This is their first real playoff, test. The Homelander says sweep time, so obviously we know how he feels about this series. I think New Orleans could probably make it competitive, but I
Hmm.
would be very surprised if OKC lost this series, especially if Zion doesn't come back at all. I know he's supposed to be reevaluated in a couple of weeks, but reevaluated usually doesn't mean that's when you're coming back. That's usually when they just check to see how you're doing. So, in 2 weeks, by that point, I mean, that's what, like game 3, 4-ish,
Yeah.
right? So that, that's pretty much halfway through the series. So I think OKC is going to win this series.
Yeah, me too. I think they would probably win it 4-1. I'm just going to give, New Orleans just one game, and I think that's just kind of being generous. But overall, I think New Orleans is a dangerous team. If Zion was there, I think you would be talking about this series completely differently. I think this would be a very competitive. It wouldn't surprise me if it went like 6 or 7 games. But if he does miss the entire series, that's where I think it turns into a 4-1. And I think the weakness of the Pelicans is for sure going to be Valanciunas. I think he's going to probably get played off the floor with the pick and roll because I know that OKC is very lethal when it comes to that pick and roll, especially with Shea and Chet. But, it should be intriguing to see what Herb Jones does. I think he's probably the X factor for the Pelicans as well because I think, he's got to guard probably Shea like 90% of the game, and that's going to be tough because Shea is the best offensive guy on the floor between the two teams. So will he be able to limit him? Probably not. I think, Shea is going to handle his business. And like Homelander said, it's probably either going to be a sweep or 4-1 for me.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think 4-1 makes sense because it's just, in general, it's very difficult to sweep a team in the NBA. But I think OKC is the better team. I would still probably lean OKC even if Zion was healthy. But like you said, I think you would probably say it'd be like more like a 6-7 game series. Um, I just think again, you got the best player on the floor. And in general, if you got the best player on the floor, with two teams that are kind of matched in terms of like, the talent level, then that's probably where you lean, that team, right? So I mean, Shea, obviously he's been playing MVP caliber basketball this year. So, and I think, against this New Orleans team, he should probably continue to do that, because I think he's played pretty well against this New Orleans team. I know, like you said, they do have some good defenders. They do have size and length on the wings, but I think he's going to be able to, kind of figure that out over the course of the series. And I think they'll probably be fine, and be able to move on to the next round. Plus, home court advantage is always helpful, and if it ever, gets to a, lengthy series, right, you always want to have, that last game at home. Yeah, you went 2-1 against them. Yeah, exactly. And I'm pretty sure Zion was there, for the, for all of those games. So
Yeah.
I think you have to favor OKC in that one. I mean, obviously regular season, different from the playoffs, but, I think you got to pick OKC in this series.
Yeah, and that game will be on Sunday, so that'll be a game that we recap in our live stream that night. But yeah, it's going to be exciting. I think I'm really excited to see OKC. If you want me to be honest, I really want to see what this team is capable of because we got a glimpse of it in the play-in last year, but now they're legit. They're the number 1 seed. It's crazy. I think they've got an immense amount of talent. It's just the youth is like a double-edged sword. We kind of talked about that last season, where it's like they might get a little too giddy, might get a little too shot happy or something like that. Just mess up or something like that. But they could also potentially use their youth to their advantage and, potentially run New Orleans off the court, which is kind of what they've done in the regular season. So that's kind of how I feel about it. It's going to be entertaining, though. With or without Zion, I think it's going to be amazing.
They might get a little too giddy.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I didn't even realize that. No pun intended. My gosh. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Giddy is in like happy, not Giddy is in Josh Giddy.
No, I got you. But yeah, and that's the thing. I think, he is really one of the X factors, I think, for OKC. Because again, to close the season, he played much better. And he's a good player. The earlier part of the season, it looked kind of rough. Homelander says LMAO. Yeah, it was pretty funny.
Yeah, I didn't even notice it at first.
And then Jalen Williams, right? That's the other guy where, he's quietly been, a terrific player for them, right? He's gotten better.
This is J-Dub, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
Exactly. Jalen Williams.
Cool.
The starter.
Cool,
Yeah,
got
exactly.
it. Just making sure there's 2 of them.
Yeah, the wing.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
wing. Although I do like the other one as well, the
Yeah.
big. But But either way, that's another factor, right? Where he's kind of like, sort of like an athletic, physical, lengthy wing. And I kind of wonder, what he looks like in terms of matching up against, New Orleans wings, right? Because, they're a little bit different, right? Ingram is a different type of wing, from compared to Jalen Williams, right? He's not quite as physical. He's a lot more, kind of skilled, I guess a little bit more, slower, more methodical, right? Compared to Jalen Williams, who can kind of just go, right? He can kind of get out and run. Obviously he's got incredible length. So I kind of wonder what that matchup looks like as well, right? Because you'd imagine, right, that those guys will probably spend a little bit of time on each other, obviously. So Lou Dort, right? You would think he'd spend some time, on McCollum, maybe, because you want kind of like a physical guy on him that can kind of disrupt him. But yeah, I think New Orleans does have some offensive options, but I think you have to lean OKC. I just think the talent level at the top, is really good in Shea. And I think they have enough that they should be able to pull it out, especially without Zion. I mean, like, come on.
Yeah, I agree. And it's like, looking around, like, even like the Jalen Williams thing, he can get to his spots, just as good as Shea. And he can play great off the ball with the cuts, everything. I think it's just a matter of, can he outplay Brandon Ingram? Because I think if he outplays Brandon Ingram, then series is a sweep, guaranteed.
Right.
But if Ingram elevates, then I think it could be competitive, because I think people are also not really even talking about CJ McCollum, although rightfully so, because he hasn't really looked that great in the past 2 games. But if he shows up, that could potentially be a different ball game. And OKC, I think their defense would be challenged, especially having to deal with Trey Murphy and his length as well. And then you got Herb Jones. We know what he can do as well. But I think, they're probably going to target Valanciunas in that pick and roll. I could just feel it. Like,
yeah,
and he's and I think we're probably going to see him get subbed out very early, and Nance is going to come in, and I think that could potentially cause some problems for a guy like Chet.
Right. Yeah. And then, because when you have Nance in there, you can switch a lot more.
Yeah.
And he's just, a lot more athletic, right? He's a little bit better of a role threat because, he can finish, and kind of sky through the air. And you kind of wonder, like, against OKC's second units, when they're going to get a little bit smaller. I guess, to ask the Homelander, obviously they traded for Gordon Hayward. What do you think in terms of, like, how he's been in terms of how they've acquired him? Because, like, some of the numbers, I think, when he first got there looked kind of rough. I feel like they've been a little bit better since then. But, does he seem like a guy to you that can be, like, that can still be like a rotational guy that you can put out there, for stretches to kind of just help, with some of the offense or whatever? Or is he just kind of a guy that, you're just not really sold on? I do kind of wonder, because I feel like with OKC, it'll be interesting to see what the second units do, right? Like with a guy like Isaiah Joe, who do you turn to as that second big, right? Is it Jalen Williams? Is it Biyombo, who doesn't really play? And others, right? And I'm assuming, right, you're going to see more Jalen Williams with the second unit as well, right? The guard wing, right?
Yeah.
I'm assuming he's going to kind of lead the units when Shea's not on the floor, because you don't really want any scenarios where both of them are off the floor, because I think that's not going to be great. So I do kind of wonder, the other role players for OKC, because they do have some guys off the bench that can, kind of light it up, like an Isaiah Joe who can hit threes, from all over. But I think I do kind of wonder, because I feel like New Orleans is, has a deeper roster, but and that could potentially be the difference in a couple of those games. He says he is a waste of a roster spot.
Ooh.
That's kind of the feeling, that's kind of the sense that I'm getting, like, from, the numbers that I've seen, in terms of, like, it doesn't seem like he's been that great. I think it has to do with, like, it's a big expiring contract, and that just gives you probably some more flexibility in the offseason. Maybe you trade for somebody else and bring them in, or maybe you can get, like, a mid-level exception or whatever to sign a guy and bring them in that's a little bit better than a minimum contract. But yeah, it doesn't seem like he's been all that great. But the good news is that you're still winning games, so it really hasn't mattered all that much, right? You have a really talented roster there. So
Yeah.
that's why I think we're picking them to win this series, because I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and like, I don't know, it should be intriguing, especially considering the personnel and how they match up. I think they match up pretty fair. And like Homelander said, OKC went 2-1 against them, so it's not like it was like, crazy margins or anything like that. And 2-1 I think is pretty respectable, so that's about as close to even as you can get. So I think it'll be fun to watch. It's just a matter of, Zion being out. That takes away, I think, a lot of the Pelicans' identity. Because at this point, I think we know that Zion is better than Brandon Ingram. Not to say, Brandon Ingram is bad, but, like you said, even like the fit is awkward when they are together. So maybe Brandon Ingram can really step up and elevate, but it's going to take a lot.
Then you kind of wonder, depending on how this looks, without Zion, let's say if they kind of just get smoked by Oklahoma City, maybe you kind of explore, okay, maybe we might have to explore maybe moving on from Ingram. Not saying that they are going to trade him, but you just
Yeah.
kind of wonder because
Or
then it's like you
McCollum.
can kind of see, yeah, or CJ. I don't know, but I do kind of wonder, what would happen there because I think, they're in a different spot than OKC because OKC this is their first playoff run, so we haven't even seen these guys together in a playoff environment. But with New Orleans, those guys have been playing for a little while now, and they've made the playoffs twice. Obviously, they've had some bad injury luck, but I don't know. It's just rough because we haven't seen the playoff basketball with those two guys together, so it's kind of hard to get a real sense. But I feel like when they're together, I don't know. It just doesn't seem like long term it's going to be able to work out. But
Yeah.
I think with OKC, I think because the offense is kind of pretty much kind of controlled by Shea. I think it's kind of like it kind of allows the other guys to kind of just be able to play off of him better because I think there's a much better established hierarchy, in that offense, compared to New Orleans and Dagnall. I think also is the better coach, even though I don't think Willie Green is bad. But I just feel like with New Orleans at times it may feel like it might be kind of difficult for them to figure out all the different pieces that they have. Even though again they did win 50 games or 49 games. So
Yeah, absolutely. Both very competitive teams. And yeah, once
yeah.
again, shout out for the Pelicans to actually get out of the play-in and bouncing back from, the loss
Right.
against the Lakers.
So moving on to the kind of back over to the East, I
Hmm.
guess. With the Heat, kind of in their spot they're in right without Jimmy Butler. And then you factor in, with the Bucks, right? It sounds like Giannis is probably going to be out for a little bit, right? Possibly, half maybe more of the series against the Pacers. And then obviously Embiid,
Hmm.
right? Physically doesn't really seem like he's the same guy. You almost kind of wonder at this point, is Boston kind of almost just a lock to come out of the East? Obviously, nothing is guaranteed because you got to be healthy. But, it almost kind of feels like, you look at the East in comparison to the West, and it's just like almost like two completely different leagues. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's so many really good teams in the Western Conference, right? The Homelander you mentioned OKC winning it all. I mean, you could make a credible case for OKC to make the finals. It's not that it's a guarantee, not that it's the most expected outcome, but they clearly have a lot of talent and they have, a guy that, seems like he's a superstar. So you would think that they could make a run, but then in the East, it's hard for me to really look at any teams other than Boston, especially given the health issues of some of these other rosters. I can't trust Milwaukee, if Giannis isn't really going to be available possibly for most of the series. And I can't really trust Philadelphia, because I don't really trust Embiid's health. Even if he were healthy, I don't know if I would completely trust Philly anyways, but
Right.
the fact that he's questioned, why would we not win it all?
You want us to answer that truthfully, or do you want us to sugarcoat it?
I think we should answer it truthfully.
Okay. Do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
I guess the main question for OKC is, I guess, when you look at the history of the league, right? Normally a young team first time in the playoffs, usually there's more of a progression. It's not normally like missed playoffs, right? You're in the play-in, in that lower-ish tier, and then you go in and then you're the one seed and then you win a title, right? Even like, OKC with their previous iteration, right? They didn't make the finals the first year they were together, right? They were together, they were whatever they were, right? Like a lower seed. Then they made the playoffs. Then they won 50 whatever games. And then they started, making some deeper runs and got to the finals. It took some time. And I think that's kind of where you know, that's kind of where it's kind of hard to, for me to envision them being able to win it all and win 4 rounds. Mainly only because, they haven't proven it yet, right? They've been able to win a ton of regular season games. It's just the question is, are they going to be able to do it, in a 7-game playoff series where the other team has the ability to kind of lock in and focus on what they do, take guys out of the series potentially. And even the other non-Shea guys, right? Like you also have to question what they're going to look like in a non-playoff environment, the matchups as well. And I think, say for OKC, right? They've beaten Denver, to be fair, right? 3-1. I think in one of those Jokic didn't play. So, but I mean, either way, 2-2 split, 3-1, whatever. So it's not like they have no shot of beating Denver, right? Because I mean, they do have the talent. I think the issue is that you almost kind of have to see it to believe it, right? It's not that they have a 0% chance. I don't think they have a 0% chance at all. Obviously they're the 1 seed, so they're going to have home court, and I think that's incredibly important. Um, you know, the fact that they're going to be the 1 seed all the way through the West, but then it's like if you get out of the West, what does it look like against Boston? I don't know. I mean, Boston has won 64 games. I'm not saying they're not legit, but obviously in the Eastern Conference, it is different. We've seen Boston, lose to some of the better teams in the Western Conference. So I'm not necessarily completely sold that they're just an absolute juggernaut either. So I think OKC does have a chance. I just can't confidently say that they can, that they're gonna win it all. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. And the way that I look at it, like in the West, I would say they probably have maybe second or third best odds to win the chip, or come out of the West. Just because I think they're like you said, they're extremely young. And when you're as young like that, like when you're a young team like that, you don't have the experience of losing, a series, yet. And I think a lot of teams when they lose a series, they never want to feel that again. And OKC doesn't have that. They have vets, sure, but not a crazy amount with a lot of postseason success. And I think that's something that's hurting them. Like honestly, if you want me to be real, I would probably take Boston over OKC. Like I think Boston has a higher chance of winning the finals than OKC. And that's coming from both number 1 seeds, and that's just due to the fact that Boston has been there before. They've lost, and they're coming back and better, and they're there with a vengeance. So that's kind of how I feel about it. But with OKC, there's a lot of positives. I think the positives outweigh the negatives, for sure. Like you can't complain about the group and the core of these guys being the number 1 seed, especially with how young they are. But I think it's just going to take some more experience. And like you even said, I think the other obstacle is definitely Denver, because are they really going to beat Denver in a 7-game series? Probably not. Could they take them to 7? Yes, but I don't think they would come out on top.
Yeah, I think that's the main difficulty there. Fair, but this is the second coming of Russ, Katie, and Harden mic drop. And that's the thing. I
It
do think
is.
they have a really and I think yeah, exactly. And I do think they have a very talented young core. And that's the thing where like they have the chance to get better, right, over the course of the next several years, right? Because you have Shea, you have Jalen Williams, you have Chet Holmgren. That's pretty much your core, right? So after that, then you just kind of have to find the guys around them, right? What do you do with some of the other guys on the roster? Maybe you keep some of them and hope to get better. Maybe you move them and bring in somebody more established along the way. I don't
Hmm.
know. I think the thing for OKC is, let's say if they don't make the finals this year, is that a disappointment for them? Like I'm sure the players would probably be disappointed, but like in the long run, it's probably not, right? Like I think it would be way more disappointing for Boston to not come out of the East than for OKC to not come out of the West. You know what I mean? Because like Boston made all these big moves, because they're trying to win the championship this year. And if they don't get it done, everybody's going to look at them and kind of just say, wow, what a disappointment. If even if OKC loses before they come, before they get to the finals, I don't think people are going to look at it like that. And that's the thing when you mention the second coming of Russ, Katie, and Harden, you got a bright future. Why are people sleeping on the Celtics? They're going to come out of the East.
I mean, I think it's just because like it's the Celtics, it's Jason Tatum. We've kind of seen them come up short, and especially after last year, I'd for sure have a bunch of questions. Considering that you lost to Miami, and no disrespect to the Miami team, but nobody saw that coming. Like the Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, they were supposed to go to the finals last year, and that didn't happen. And credit to Miami, they got past a bunch of juggernauts, but the Celtics should not have lost last year, and I think that's kind of carrying over to this season, which is why people are kind of up in arms about,
Yeah.
them having a clear-cut path where it's like they might have to earn it again.
Right.
But, I think that's just
And
my point of view, though.
yeah, and I think the other reason why people are sleeping on Boston, I don't think people are sleeping on them. Like you said, I think most people believe they're going to come out of the East. I think the question is, are they actually going to beat whoever comes out of the West? I think most people expect the Nuggets to come out of the West, and I think if they do, I think people are going to be concerned about the fact that Boston, in crunch time, just has not been quite as good as the Nuggets, even though they've won way more games, right? But a lot of that is because they're blowing a lot of teams out of the water, right? Now, again, because they're not in as many close games, you would kind of just assume that that automatically means that they're better. It's just, we have seen them play against the Nuggets in the regular season. And in both games, right, it came down to, right, it was a competitive game back and forth. And then at the end, right, the Nuggets were able to execute better, right? And because they have some game managers that I think are a little bit better at the end of games, right? You have Jokic, you have Jamal Murray, right? Whereas like Tatum and Brown are more so one-on-one scorers, right? Not that they can't get others involved. It's just at the end of the game, what they're probably going to do is they're probably going to try to take some tough shots. Whereas the Nuggets, they're going to, work to create some really quality offense. If we don't win the title, the Celtics will. Denver is not repeating. And I think,
That's fire. That's an interesting take.
yeah,
That's kind of hot,
and I
bro.
think, and I think, the case, when he says if we don't win the title, the Celtics will, Denver is not repeating. I think the case to make for the Nuggets maybe not repeating is you could at least make the case that the West is better than it was last year. So it may not necessarily be as easy for them to just kind of roll through the West like they did last year, right? Like say, when you look at the path that they have to go through, right? They may have to face some tough matchups, right? They're the 2 seed, so that means assume they play the Lakers, then they would play whoever wins between Minnesota and Phoenix, right? We know that both of those teams have done a pretty good job against them, in the regular season. Of course, playoffs are different. And then if they come out of that, right, then they would have to play, presumably either OKC or the Clippers or the Mavs, right? And again, those teams are probably better than the teams that they faced, towards, in the Western Conference last year. No hate, but Jamal Murray is going to get hurt. And that's kind of the other, question, I guess, and you can make that case about any team is,
Absolutely.
in order to win a title, you do have to have good luck in terms of health, right? You have to be healthy the entire season pretty much, or you have to get healthy at the right time, right? The Nuggets, they had what? Back-to-back seasons where they had bad luck in terms of injury, right? Jamal Murray tears his ACL a couple seasons ago and then misses the rest of that season and then all of the following season, right? Then Michael Porter Jr. 2 seasons ago, right? He had, his back injury or whatever it was, and then pretty much missed all of that season, right? And then last year, they finally got healthy again, right? They changed up their rotation, right? They brought in Caldwell Pope, they brought in Bruce Brown, and they won the title. Then the other case for the Nuggets is the second unit. Is it going to be, what's it going to look like compared to last year's, right? Because the bench, I think some people probably feel like might be a little bit thinner, right? You don't have Bruce Brown, you don't have Jeff Green. You're going to be relying on Christian Brown, as well as Peyton Watson. What do those guys look like in playoff basketball? Maybe they'll be good, maybe they won't be. And if they're not, right, that's probably the case where then if you're Denver, you probably only have like 6 playable guys. So I think there's a case to be made for why they're not going to repeat. But I think, again, because of the fact that they won the title last year, I think people have the most confidence in them. And that's why it is a different Nuggets team.
What is that emoji? That's pretty funny. But yeah, he's right.
Yeah.
It for sure is. They're missing a couple of role guys, really in Bruce Brown. But, nonetheless, as different as they may be, in that second unit at times, they're still amazing, and that's the concern.
I think that's the factor. Even though they're very thin after the starting five is incredible. And I think that's really the difference there. I guess,
and that's what we were talking about last year. Like that, it's crazy. Like it's all repeating. It feels like we're in a time loop. The Miami Heat are back in the playoffs because of the play-in, and then we're talking about Denver and our concerns, and it's the same thing as last year, where it's like starting five is impeccable, bench is so weak, can they survive the non-Jokic minutes? Like that's the big question of the day.
Yeah, and the answer was they didn't get killed in the 9 minutes. So I think that's the main thing is the starting five is basically the same. It's just a question of are they going to be able to sustain, health-wise, the matchups that they play are going to be different and they may be tougher, they may be better. It's just a matter of, they might just be better than the other teams. Because I think that's kind of the factor going into the playoffs is the West got better. Did it get better enough that a team is going to be able to take out the Nuggets? And I guess outside of the Nuggets, I guess you'd have to look at OKC, right? I guess, a team like Dallas, right? The Clippers at one point looked great and then kind of fell off. Now we don't really know what we're really going to get with them, especially with Kawhi's health, kind of in question. Obviously the Suns, right? We're kind of a shiny new toy. We don't really know with them either. Minnesota, I feel like people have kind of flip-flopped on them a ton. And I feel like confidence in them is probably the lowest that it's been, right? Pretty much almost all year. considering that they're probably playing the worst matchup that they could have had, right? I don't think people really have a lot of faith that Minnesota's going to pull that out. So who knows? But I mean, I don't know. But I understand, like, in terms of like there is a world where Denver doesn't come out of the West, and it may not be because like they choked or anything. It could just be because there was a team that just played a little bit better, or maybe they have some bad luck in terms of health. But I think that's the reason why people are, if people are sleeping on Boston, I think it's because people believe that the Nuggets are the best team in the NBA, even though the Celtics have by far the best record.
Yeah, it's going to be wild. I think these playoffs are going to be super duper exciting. From both conferences, I think there's a lot of hardcore crazy matchups in the first round for the East. I'm not sure how it's going to end up looking. I think the East is a lot more predictable than the West. I think the West, there's a lot more wild cards and teams that just are kind of like underseeded, if you want me to be honest, where it's like, you're
Yeah.
looking at like some of these seeds and, in the East, they'd be powerhouses. So that's the real, I think, dichotomy that's going on here. And it should be wild to see these games in action. And I'm just happy that we get a plethora of them tomorrow and Sunday.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in the West, you had teams that won 46 games miss the playoffs, right? And then in the East, you had teams that won less than 40 games get in the play in, as the 9-10 seed. So that just kind of goes to show how brutal the Western Conference is in terms of how many good teams are there. And that's why, again, it should be really fun because I think, like you said, I don't think there's a bad matchup or in terms of like, a series where you're like, I have no interest in this at all. I think all of these, series are interesting. And, we talked about it in our previous podcast. Did you guys hear about Jonte Porter? Hopefully he didn't rub off on Mike. Yeah, that was not a very smart thing for him to do, if I'm gonna be honest.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
talked about that on our last episode. You could check that out. Yeah, and yeah, you're right. Hopefully that didn't rub off on Michael Porter Jr.
Yeah. I mean,
Curious Mike.
yeah. 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 Not exactly great there. But either way, yeah, but either way, I'm sure he'll probably enjoy, watching his brother play, on his couch or wherever he is right now.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, I don't know. It's wild. Like that, he's got a lot of issues, but yeah. If you want to hear like our full thoughts on that, can you go check out our most recent episode? We kind of talked about that towards the end in like the news and rumors section. Yeah, it was a good episode, I thought, but yeah, there's a lot to look forward to. I think with the playoffs.
Right. So
What other storylines do we have to talk about?
yeah, I mean, I guess, we could also, kind of mention, there's been some, we'll probably talk in more detail about, this as we get into the off season, right? But, obviously there's been some rumors kind of flying around about, some of these players, right? Like, in terms of Cleveland, right? Obviously that's going to be something to watch because there's been so many rumors going on about, you know, teams are already kind of focusing on, possibly picking him up, if the Cavs fall out of the playoffs. You mentioned Homelander says thoughts on Trey. That was another thing that we actually talked about in the last live stream when the
Yeah.
Hawks lost to the Bulls,
Hmm.
where you kind of wonder what happens with Trey Young. Because we know that the Trey Young DeJounte Murray backcourt hasn't worked, right? It hasn't been good. Last year, right? They were what the 7, 8 seed or whatever, 7 seed or whatever,
Hmm.
and then they lost. It was a 6 game series, so it wasn't like they got swept, but it didn't really leave you feeling like super confident that the Hawks, you know, had a super bright future with this backcourt. We thought they were going to be better than they were last year, and then they managed to be worse. So that's not a great sign at all, and that's why I think they're going to have to decide between either Trey Young or DeJounte Murray. I feel like there's been a lot more rumors as of late about Trey Young. I know he kind of said like he wants to be in Atlanta. I think he said that recently, but I don't know what Atlanta does because we've talked about it before, right? They're a weird kind of organization where it's like they've made some bizarre moves, right? Where they've tried to kind of just cut costs, right? Just kind of sending guys away and not getting back anything, right? We know that they waited forever to trade John Collins. By the time they traded him, his value was so low they got nothing back for him, right? They traded Kevin Herter and got nothing back for him, right? So kind of just straight up salary dumps. And then they also, I think, again, think when they made that Eastern Conference Finals run, they kind of tricked themselves into thinking that it was sustainable. And that's what got them into this mess where they ended up giving a ton of picks to bring in DeJounte Murray. And he just hasn't been good enough individually to kind of uplift the Hawks and make them better. Even though he's been good, right? He's not been like a superstar. Spider to LA and trade to San Antonio. Who knows? I mean, that's going to be kind of and that's going to be tied to what happens in this postseason, right? Because let's say Cleveland gets absolutely smoked in the first round, right? Like let's say it's like a 5-game series like it was last year and Orlando just crushes them,
Yeah.
right? That kind of heightens, the odds and the potential that, they could end up moving on from him. And I think if you're Cleveland, if you don't really have much confidence that you're going to keep him, you kind of have to move him, right? Because I think if you're Cleveland and you can trade him while his value is still relatively solid, right? Maybe it's dropped, compared to what it was in the past, right? Given the fact that Cleveland hasn't been, elevated in terms of the playoffs, they've been a first round exit. You know, Probably not going to go much further than that, right? Maybe they, maybe they beat Orlando, but probably not much further than that. But either way, um, if you're Cleveland and you can get something back for him, right? Maybe some picks and a couple of okay players. You can say like, all right, we can just build around the young guys like we were doing before. We can just build around Darius Garland, Evan Mobley. Maybe we move Jared Allen somewhere else, right? And kind of, swap him with some other big man and kind of change up the fit. I don't know. But, that's kind of something to think about, right? And then, obviously, with San Antonio, right, they're going to be looking to add some talent. What do they do in the draft, right? Do they decide maybe they want a young point guard in the draft, or do they want a more established point guard like Trey Young, right? The Lakers, right? If they get destroyed in the first round, right, you're going to expect to hear a lot of rumors about them probably going, chasing after stars. So that's where I think the playoffs is a huge factor, in all of these rumors because of the fact that, for a lot of these teams, depending on what happens, that's probably going to shape what they decide to do, right? Like, let's say if Denver for some of these teams, it may not matter, right? Like if Denver loses in the playoffs and they don't win the title, I mean they're not going to be able to make a lot of significant moves. They're kind of locked into who they have, right? Like the most significant move they could make is if they move like Michael Porter Jr. or something, but they're not going to do that, right? They're
Yeah.
going to keep what they have. Homelander mentioned thoughts on the upcoming draft. Um, I think a lot of people have said it's bad. I mean, I think the difference is that I think there's probably a lot of players that can help teams, but there's probably not like a lot of superstars, right? You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like
I don't
like
think there's
there's
a
no
single one.
yeah, like there's no Wembys in this draft, right? There's none of that, right?
Yeah.
Probably not even like a Brandon Miller,
No.
or somebody like that. But
Nope.
there's I think, a decent amount of quality players that can probably help teams out where it's like their floors are probably high, but their ceilings probably are a little bit lower than probably some other, top tier picks, right? Some people think it might be the worst draft since what was it, 2013? That was the
Mm.
one where it was like Anthony Bennett that went number 1. I don't know because you never really know until the players actually get in and play. But I do think there's some good players in the draft. I just don't necessarily know if like any of them are going to be like superstars, right? Like if they were in like if some of the top guys, like let's say whoever the top 3, 4 picks are in this draft, if they were in some of the other drafts, they might not even be top 10 picks. But
Yeah.
in this draft, because they're amongst the best guys that you have, they're going to be drafted higher.
Yeah.
Like, you know
And
what I mean?
yeah.
Like, if Anthony Bennett was in the draft before or the draft after, there's no way he would go number 1,
Sure.
right? But because he was in that draft, right? And even then, that was a surprise. But you know what I mean? Like, just in general, like, it kind of depends on the talent in the draft. So I think there's more like high floor guys, but
Yeah.
probably lower ceiling. It doesn't mean that they're bad. Maybe they do stink. I don't know. Maybe it's just a stinky draft. But I do think that there are some decent players in this draft. It's not like there's nobody. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
And it's like the way that I talked to you about it, like off camera, is like, when you have a dominant player like Zach Edey, where he's the best player in college at the time, and he's not even a
Right.
top 10 lottery projected pick, that kind of tells you all you need to know about the draft. It's not horrible. I don't think it's going to be the worst. I don't think it's going to be like 2013. I think there's a lot of guys that will help contenders, but if you're in a rebuild or, if you just plain suck, then this draft is not the one where you're kind of looking for your franchise cornerstone. That's
Right.
kind of how I
Yes.
feel.
Right. So for teams like Detroit or, San
Washington.
Antonio or Washington, right? Those teams have a pretty good shot at getting like a top 3 pick. And, even if they get it, how enthused are they going to be that they have the number 1 pick in this draft compared to like, like if you're Detroit, you had the worst record in the NBA last year and you dropped from 1 to 5. But let's say in this year they have the worst record, but they stay at 1. Okay, well that's probably going to suck because you don't get Wemby. You end up getting whoever the number 1 pick in this year's draft is going to be, which that guy's not going to have the same ceiling. Zach Edey is trash, not going to translate at all. Zubac at best. What the heck? Oh my goodness.
That's a fair comparison, if you want
I
me to be
mean,
honest.
yeah, I don't really think he's going to be a star player. You know what
No,
I mean? Like,
no,
I think in college basketball, and that's kind of sometimes the hard part, like when you're evaluating, what it looks like in college compared to the NBA, because it's so different, right? Like in
yeah,
college basketball, there's no LeBrons, there's no Giannis's, there's no Zions, normally, right? Like, you could be playing a bunch of teams that don't really have a lot of NBA talent. It doesn't mean that those players are bad, but it's just going to look a lot different, right? In college basketball, because of the lack of talent compared to the NBA, right? The coaching systems, the way they play is very different. And then there are some guys that will look kind of mediocre in college, but then in the NBA, because the game is so different, right? It's a lot more fast paced, a lot more up and down and whatnot. They're going to look better. And then there's going to be some guys that because of, in college, the structure is a lot more rigid, right? They'll look great in college, but then they don't look as great in the NBA, right? You know what I mean? Like we've
yeah,
seen that before with a lot of players. And I feel like for him, not really that athletic, more like a big guy. Not saying he's like, completely unskilled, but I just don't necessarily know if his game is going to translate to the NBA level where like I don't think he's going to be a star, right? Like maybe he's not going to be like he could be potentially a playable guy. It just kind of comes down to really can he defend? Because I think if he can defend, that's probably the first step, right? Because I don't think you're going to be able to be like just like a off the bench big man scorer, right? Like those type of players, that's not really much of a thing too much anymore unless they can space the floor and shoot threes, which isn't really his game.
he
So he's
can't
probably
shoot
going to
and he
have
can't pass and he can't really defend. That's his problem.
yeah, so that's going to have to be the thing. Can he at least defend? And if you go there, then that can help. And then, does he have any real offensive game in the NBA at all? If not, then that's going to probably be rough, right? Because I
Yeah,
think in the NBA from the big man spot, you're either going to have to, be able to play both ends relatively well, or at the very least, you're going to have to be able to defend well to be like a playable big man, right? Like, say, like a guy like Thomas Bryant, on the Heat, right? He doesn't really play because even though he's a solid offensive player, he doesn't really defend all that well. And it's like it's kind of hard to put in, a big that doesn't really defend. He's just tall. I think that's kind of mainly what it is. You know what I mean? Like I'm
yeah,
not trying to pick on him or insult him.
yeah,
I just feel like that's kind of where it starts, right? So it's like and like you said, all the NBA scouts, nobody has him projected as a top 5 pick, even though like you said, he was the best player in college basketball. Even though his team didn't win, which doesn't matter at all,
yeah.
right?
But
It's
look
more
at
so
his team. Like, of course he's gonna
yeah,
have dominant numbers like that. If you're that big, that tall, and you're maybe only going up against like Klingon, and then the rest of your team is kind of like mediocre or below average even. Of course you should dominate. But I think the issue is gonna be like, how does it translate? Like I'm higher on guys like Cody Williams, which is J Dub's younger brother, Rob Dillingham. I'm higher on guys like that. But even those guys, they're not franchise changing people. I think they're people that fit right into the system. But
yeah,
we'll
yeah.
get into the draft. As we get closer to the off season. So, but yeah, the draft is not pretty though. I can tell you that.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing because
Yeah,
again, it's like you said, when the guy that was basically the best player in college basketball isn't really looked at as like a high lottery pick. That's not great, right? Because
yeah,
like we remember like say when Zion was at Duke, right, and he was looked at pretty much as the best player in college basketball, and he was the number 1 pick, right? Nobody had him going any lower than 1. Maybe somebody had him at 2, but not any lower than that, right? But in the case of Zach Edey, people just don't see it because like the Homelander said, he's mainly just tall, not super skilled, not that athletic, right? Like he said, can't really space the floor, doesn't really defend. Not saying he's Kwame Brown, right? Like nobody's necessarily saying that. We don't know. But
yeah,
at the same time, there's reasons to be skeptical of, will he be able to translate to the NBA? If he does, cool, right? Then it's like if you're a team that has a 7-4 big, that's an advantage, right? Look at Wemby for the Spurs,
for
right?
sure.
But do I think Zach Edey's going to be Wemby?
Oh, he
Uh,
can't even dribble the basketball.
Right.
And
Yeah,
that's no
exactly. Probably.
disrespect. Like I mean, like in terms of how Wemby can do it, like he's just not on that level. He's kind of just a black hole in the paint, and he does his thing, which he should, because he is that tall. And that's what he did in college, and that's what worked for Purdue. So I get it. But I mean, do we have anything else to kind of touch on? I mean, I guess if we look at the official playoff matchups, as they're locked in, it'd be Boston and Miami, New York, Philly, Milwaukee, Indiana, Cleveland, Orlando in the East. That's pretty good if you
Yeah.
ask me. That's pretty stacked. I think it's going to be fun to watch. I think we both, are convinced the Celtics will probably come out of the East as they should. There's no reason that they shouldn't, in my opinion, just considering the competition over there. Then, obviously we move on to the West. We've got OKC, New Orleans. Then we've got Denver, Lakers. We've got Minnesota Timberwolves versus the Suns, and then LA Clippers versus Dallas Mavericks. I think every single one of these matchups has the potential to be the absolute peak of basketball, especially entertainment-wise. I think we're going to get some crazy series, and the amount of star power and star talent and duels that are going to be on display, it's insane, and one for the ages for sure.
And I think that's kind of the thing is, like you said, there's so many great matchups and just so many storylines because, again, every team has a best and worst case scenario where it's like, if everything goes right, this thing is going to happen. If everything goes wrong, this thing could happen, right? Like, because we've talked about them right in our previous, episode, right? Like, say, what happens to the Suns if they lose in the first round, right? Because they put, this talent together. What happens if they lose in the first round? Same with Minnesota, right? If they lose in the first round, going to be a lot of questions there, right? Clippers and Mavs, right? What happens if one of those two teams loses in the first round? Because we know, obviously, with the Clippers, they've been together for a writer. The script writers cooked. Yeah.
Facts.
Yeah.
Facts. It's crazy. The
Exactly.
amount of narratives in history. It's wild, man. We're getting so many rematches earlier than
Yep.
expected. And a lot of
Yep.
fire matchups between some younger teams that are clearly hungry.
Yeah, so I guess, just kind of curious, Homelander, obviously you'll be rooting for your Oklahoma City Thunder. What is the other matchup potentially that you're kind of most interested in the first round outside of obviously, your team? Because I know you're locked
Yeah.
into your team. I'm just kind of curious, because I think there's a lot of, different ones out there. Because like in the East, I'm really intrigued by the Knicks Sixers one just because of the fact that like, you got Jalen Brunson in the Knicks. They've been playing great. Versus, Joel Embiid. What does he look like physically over the course of the series, right? I remember, way back in the offseason, right? Everybody was talking about, what if Embiid, asks out, and could he go to the Knicks? Now obviously he's playing against that team. Philadelphia, if they lose, right? We know they have a ton of cap space. So what do they do in the offseason, right? Because there's a lot of factors, right? There's already rumors about, Tobias Harris probably going to go to Detroit, right? The fact that that comes out like before they even play a single playoff game is kind of insane. So I mean, but obviously, Suns versus Wolves. This is Ant-Man's coming out party. Pause.
I mean, that's a good point, Like if Anthony Edwards
Right.
has an amazing series, we're going to be talking about him a lot more than we already have been, especially considering that we know the Wolves are going to probably make some sort of roster change, probably involving Karl Anthony Towns. That means the roster is going to be geared more towards Anthony Edwards, and that's probably going to mean more success for him. So I agree. And then also, even with from the Suns' perspective, I think anytime you have Devin Booker in the playoffs is normally pretty entertaining, as well as Durant, and then we kind of get Bradley Beal back in the playoffs. So I think it should be fun to watch. It's just a matter of, are they going to flame out early? I don't think so. I think they're going to kind of carry the momentum of the latter part of the season with them into the playoffs, which probably means the Suns are going to beat the Wolves, in my opinion. But I'm really hoping Anthony Edwards has a crazy season or series.
I think for the Wolves, it really just kind of comes down to, like you said, what does Edwards do against this Suns team? Because he hasn't played very well in the regular season against them. I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons as to why the Suns are 3-0 in that regular season matchup because they just offensively haven't been able to score against the Suns. Because just again, it's kind of a team where it's like when you look at the Suns, they seem like a small team, because they don't really have any bigs other than Nurkic. But then it's like, hey, Durant is 7 feet tall. Nurkic is a physical 7 foot big. Um, and then you can kind of get away with putting Durant at the 5 against a team like Minnesota, where it's like you're not really concerned about them offensively. as you might, another team. It just seems like the Wolves might not be a great matchup, against the Suns. But if Anthony Edwards elevates his play, that's where you might have a chance. Suns are the dark horse. I think they're kind of an intriguing team from the perspective of, again, they've been really up and down. They closed, the regular season on a good note, right? Like, they had, the tough schedule. I think some of that ended up being kind of not really as the case because there were some guys for the other teams that weren't really playing. But I think at the very least for the Suns, you have to factor in because of the offensive firepower, they could just kind of just come out of the gates firing, just kind of run teams off the floor offensively. It's
Yeah.
just the question is that at the end of the games, what do they do? Because they haven't really been that consistent at the end of the games. It was better to close out the season, but what does it look like come playoff time? Do those guys fit together? And really, I think Bradley Beal is kind of really the biggest X factor because when he plays really well at a high level, that's generally when they have their best games, right? Obviously you're not expecting him to play, crazy. I mean, like, when you looked at his numbers to close out the season, I think he was shooting like what, 60%, from three or something
Hmm.
crazy like that. You don't expect that over the course of an entire postseason. But when he plays well and plays like the 50 million, dollar player that they were hoping to get, right? That's when the Suns look significantly better. But when he's hobbled or he's just not playing, up to the level that you would like to see out of him, that's when they look a lot more, like a mediocre-ish type of team.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Like a
I
first
think that's
round
kind of
exit kind of team.
right. Yeah, that's where they look more like a exit compared to, oh, this team could potentially come out of the finals. Because we know, to be fair, against the Nuggets, they were what, 2-2. I think one of those games was without Jamal Murray. But I think there was another one where they won without Devin Booker. So I mean, you never know, right? In come playoff time, a lot of different things can happen, right? Grayson Allen shot 50% from three, pretty much stole Klay Thompson's shooting ability.
Yeah.
For the most
Siphoned it.
part. Yeah, I mean, but what does that look like come playoff time? Does he keep it up? If he does, then that obviously helps. But if he doesn't and kind of looks more so like the Grayson Allen that we knew and loved, or I guess didn't really love in previous
Yeah. Knew and hated. Holy crap.
we didn't really love, I guess that's another factor as well. Because for the Suns, can you get enough guys outside of the big three to help you out? That's really what you're looking for. Because that was the question going into the season, and that's kind of the same question that remains. Because
Yeah.
you assume that Durant and Booker will play well. Beal, you assume, is going to have some big games. Maybe not every game, but he's gonna step up in some of these games. But who else does, right? Does Nurkic have a good stretch of playoff basketball, right? What does Grayson Allen do? What does Royce O'Neal do? And then after that, Eric Gordon. And then who knows? That's kind of the question after that, right? Durant at center, that probably is good against Minnesota for whatever reason. But it may not necessarily work against some other team. So I think, if you're the Suns, I think the fact that you got the Timberwolves in the first round is a boost, right? I think it's better than if you faced some other team in the first round. Like let's say if they were the 7th seed and they were playing the Nuggets in the first round, I think that would kind of be really difficult.
Yeah.
Or even if they were 8 playing against Oklahoma City, I think that would be kind of difficult. Not that they couldn't win, but I think it'd be a significantly tougher matchup, right?
100%. Yeah.
But
They match up better.
yeah, but the fact that you avoided the play-in and you got a good matchup, I think that's probably what's going to help them. It's just we're going to have to see because it's like that's the problem is that outside of the Nuggets, there's not a whole lot of teams that you can consistently trust because we've seen good and bad basketball from a lot of the other teams, below the top 3 seed, right? Like the Thunder, the Nuggets, and Minnesota have been pretty consistent over the course of the entire season, right? They pretty much kind of stayed the top 3 seeds other than I think at one point early in the season, Golden State was up there. But outside of that, every other team from 4 through 8, we've seen stretches where they've been way down in the play-in and then like way up top, right? Like we saw the Clippers earlier in the season when they first got Harden, they were in the play-in, right? They were like in that 7 to 10 spot, and then they climbed all the way up to 1. Then they dropped down to 4 or 5, right? Dallas at one point was a play-in team, and then they jumped all the way up to 5, right? Phoenix at one point, was doing better. Then they dropped way down into like the 7 to 10 spot, and then they got into 6. And same with the Lakers, right? At one point they were up in 5, then they dropped way down to like 9, 10, and then they kind of settled back into 7, 8. So I think that's kind of the tough part,
Yeah.
but I think there are some teams that I think could give Denver, some run, right? It doesn't mean that they're going to beat them. I don't think that if the Nuggets come out of the West, I don't think it will be the same cakewalk that it was last year. Not that they were playing bad teams. It's just they were just running roughshod through everybody, right? They lost, I think, what 3 games going into the finals, right?
Yep.
Because they lost 1 to Minnesota, 2 to Phoenix, and then 0 against LA. So
Yep.
they only lost 3 games coming out of the West. Then they lost 1 against the Heat, right?
Yep.
Are they going to lose more than 4 games this time around? I think yes. But are they going to lose 4 times in one round? I don't necessarily think so.
Nope.
But I
They're
could
back
be
to back, and I think they're repeating.
yes. But the Homelander doesn't think so, and he might be right.
Yeah. He could
He's
be.
right. Yeah, and if he's right, we will give him the credit that he will deserve.
Shout him out for sure, man.
Yeah, exactly. Because we do like a lot of these teams, and I think OKC is kind of cool because I remember when we talked about them in the offseason, and we thought that they were going to be better, but we didn't expect them obviously to be a top 3 seed. And I think the progression is kind of crazy. There's only there weren't too many people that thought that. I think there were maybe like I don't know a couple, but I think most people probably expected them to be closer to like that I don't know 5 to 7 range, not 1. That's kind of the wild part. So shout out to OKC, and we'll see if they get it done against New Orleans, which I think they will. And again, we talked about a lot of these other matchups, and we'll get into them in bigger detail. Especially as the games go through. I didn't see it coming. Yeah, exactly. I don't think the fans saw it coming either, and that's kind of the
We were
part.
happy and hyped about them, but like nobody saw them being this good.
Right. And that's kind of the interesting, prospect where it's like, what's going to happen with them, right? Are they going to continue that into the playoffs, or are they going to kind of, just flame out? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the interesting question to see because we don't normally see a team not make the playoffs and then win 50 games, right? It's different when we're talking about, say, like a team like Golden State where they've been around for forever, right? And you just kind of expect a little bit more like, up and down with them just because they're older and they're probably closer to the end. But OKC is kind of like in the beginning, and it's like, wow, and that's kind of the other factor with Chet Holmgren, where he played 0 games last year and he played 82 games, this year, right? Which is remarkable. And I think that's kind of the other question where up until the last part of the regular season, they were pretty healthy. So you kind of wonder, was the 57 games kind of like the ceiling where it's like, if they had some bad injury luck like some of these other teams, would they be a little bit lower? I don't know, because they could just be really, really good.
Yeah.
Because I definitely think they'll get out of the first round for sure. It's just a matter of are they going to be able to win the title? I'm kind of skeptical of that. But again, anything can happen. We didn't expect them to be the 1 seed. So, even if people don't expect them to make the finals, I mean, you just never know. They could. I mean, this is what happens in the NBA, right? Like, I mean, we've seen a lot of wild stuff over the last, several years. I mean, like the NBA's been around for forever, but even in like the last 5 years, there's been a lot of different things that have happened, right? Where it's like nobody saw this coming. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the tag they used to have was literally where amazing happens. I don't know why they kind of stopped saying that because I think it's the dang truth. But yeah, we've hit the hour and 20 mark, a little bit longer than what we normally do. But yeah, thank you to everybody who came out, showed up, interacted in this stream. Not going to name any names, but everybody knows who they are. Because the last time I named some names, I started laughing and broke character. Can't have that happen. So, once again, shout out to everybody who did show up and supported us and continue to support us. And, we're going to have streams tomorrow and Sunday and then more as the playoffs progress. And, we're going to continue to give our thoughts. And then we'll also have an episode out on Monday as well. So be on the lookout for that. And we will see you guys on the next live stream. Thank you, everybody, once again.